you're not going to get most of the species we're interested in that have feeders, the water features.
Insect feeders.
So, you know, if you look at the protocol and try to stay within that framework to build your sample design, its question is okay, having a control, which would be a master station. If that is not a building, then having a secondary station that is actually, because point counts alone will not get you bird assemblages.
Why is that again?
Because it misses about 50% of the birds there.
So acoustics
you need a moldable methodology.
Yeah. So acoustics can pick up rare, shy species.
Oh, yeah.
And then they, depending on when flight calls are occurring, can potentially identify a departure area versus arrival areas and areas that are being passed over. Maybe that's not...
For this question?
Yeah, again, the question is for however they're using habitat.
For one
that's what
and two.
section that.
But
Right,
if
and
it
then
is a
stay
departure
put
or a
switch
passover
the
area
jump drives.
or an arrival area, I don't know.
Yeah, you don't know where they're going to land or take off from.
Does it?
That's over an hour, 2 hour period that they're looking at there, and those birds can cover 50 miles.
Do we know? We don't even know right now if birds use certain corridors as they come here. Or that, you know, like would we say, well, we're going to have our points on all the streams. We're going to have our points on, because we know that, or don't we know that at all?
We don't know as much as we thought we knew.
All right. Okay, so that's.
Well, it's really starting to look on what radar is. What we're seeing down there is there's this broadband migration across. There appears to be possibly a little heavier along major north-south river systems.
Okay, but not enough.
Much more so in diurnal than nocturnal migrants. Nocturnal migrants appear to be more just a broadcast across the board. So it's not, because that's the one question we keep asking. Well, tell us where the migration corridor is, and we'll to keep our thing on. Well, it's a blanket. There is, yeah, it's the corridor is the eastern part of the country.
So that shouldn't influence where we put our dots, but we're not saying that part yet. We're just
Well, it does a little bit, because what there does appear to be in that dropout time, when they're saying I'm done, is that there is a filtering toward those certain habitats.
Because of the insects, maybe, or
and bulk of habitat.
Yeah.
You know, river corridor coming through an urban area, they're going to.
Yeah, I see.
We did a grad student down here in Cincinnati was looking at urban, using different size green spaces within the city of Cincinnati, and right at first light on a decent migration day, didn't matter where you're at. It was very similar. But within 3 hours, the smaller sites were void of birds, the bigger sites had more birds. So they were coming down wherever they could find. Then they were saying, okay, this isn't working. I got to find something different. So it's much more complicated than we'd like it to be.
One thing is, you know, just in looking at areas in strata, the Apostle Islands, I mean, the only really way to monitor in the Apostle Islands is probably acoustics.
Well, no. I mean, we've been doing breeding bird surveys for years.
Yeah, but financially and logistically.
Well, I'm still planning to do it again.
Oh, you are? Okay,
yeah.
I thought...
Is acoustic cheaper pretty much, or it just covers more, you don't have to have the staff?
Well, you don't have to have the staff, although it's an all volunteer program. But now again, that's not migration monitoring.
That's the problem. You need to get out there much more frequently.
Well, and so just some logistic issues. We had a hard time getting our amphibian monitors out, and I'm talking about the acoustic ones, early enough because of ice. So, yeah, I mean, there's some serious logistic issues.
And there is, you know, kind of rethinking a little bit. That could be a point of use of an acoustic. Okay, you've got a strata that is going to be very problematic getting to. Can you get to some?
Yeah.
Okay.
But
then possibly,
not always.
Right, acoustics could be useful because you can get them out there and you can't have them on the mainland. Right. Recognize, okay, this is not birds using the habitat necessarily. So by using the acoustics, it's not saying, okay, we've got X amount of birds in these different strata. But we've got a problem getting on the ground in one strata. But we can get out there some. Okay, the acoustics are running all the time. So you've got, okay, how much acoustics calls you're getting on the ads, how much you're getting on these different sites on the mainland. You get all the point counts down on the mainland. We can once in a while get out to the island. It's going to give you a second methodology then to, assuming that, you know, you have to make the assumption, this may be a very bad assumption, you have a similar percentage of birds on the mainland that's calling stop on the mainland, the percentage it stops on the islands.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would.
That's
was
a big
assumption.
leap.
The other thing is, I mean, again, this is very detailed, but details are really important in a park like Apostles.
Details are success and failure.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you can't get out in the spring early enough to put the acoustics out there, then you're talking about having done it in the fall, and then you got to have, battery power to last that long, and it's not easy.
Plus the cold really drains the batteries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably, I would think too, on the islands, there would be less variability between points, therefore you could get by with a lot less points.
Yeah, we did, actually I was involved in point counts outer island back in the 80s. Gives you an idea of how old I am. But
Are you talking about breeding bird or
migratory migration?
Migration.
And we camped out there, we were out there for 2 weeks without, we were living out there for 2 weeks. And so we were able to gather lots of information during the peak of migration. So instead of, I think you might have to think about it a little bit differently instead of the way you would think about point counts and having someone come into an area for, a day or for a morning or something. If somebody can camp out there, the park is open to that. That really worked effectively for us it was back in 1980. So you can get a number of points, and you're right, you don't need as many point counts because the migrants, when they fall out, they're being funneled right down through that south tip. And we had literally 3,000 pass rains that we were seeing, that we had warblers at our boots, we had robins over here, we had thrushes over here, vireas over here. You could see them in the sky, how they were stratified. It's really interesting. Well, we wouldn't have been able to see that if we hadn't been out there for that extended period of time.
And doing
and then the only logistical thing is if you can always get people out there early enough.
Yeah,
but it's worth it because you don't have to cover a big area. You're not really worrying about covering the entire island. You're covering that area where they're crossing over, where they're dropping out.
And doing it in a blocked time like that it doesn't violate any of the sample design things either.
Yeah, because
instead of being out there every day, you're out there for 2 weeks, and maybe another week or two later, because you still have these other points that's being done. You've got something to look back as control. And it sounds like you have some 30-year-old data. Then you can do comparison, which really does. Let's look at that sample design that was done then too.
So it doesn't violate. I always wondered about this. The whole issue of independence. I mean, if you have counting the same birds 2 days in a row, potentially, if they are sticking around at a site, is that not an issue?
Well, actually, the problems goes the opposite way with migration. Almost all statistical analysis are dependent on a closed population.
Right. That's
and migration got an open population.
Big problem, yeah.
But again, for this question, you're looking at very habitat. On a monster migration day, every habitat may be all used. 2 days later, they're now down just to the best habitat. So even though it's the same bird, they're all working toward that, telling you a lot about habitat values. Where you would get at the potential of what percentage of these are new birds coming in is if there's a banding station. Because now you're getting recaptures and you're getting that type of thing. And what Rebecca said is exactly right. To see, as far as energetic condition, whether the fat they have at that moment is a plus or minus is the blood. What we're looking at by taking fat classing is a more broader look at it. Is fat and mass going up or down over that time frame?
Right.
It's not that moment in time where they plus or minus.
Well, and I think, the whole idea of statistic validity is a good question with like outer island in fall migration, because I know I've talked to people who've done that in the fall and they've seen birds start to head down and then they circle back up and they do it again and again. Yeah. And if you're not watching the right place, you could be, like, say you're looking this way instead of at the south tip of the island, you could be really getting that, skewed in a strong way.
And that's part of the reason why in the protocol we're going for 5-minute count instead of 10. Migration point counts can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they go 10 minutes to me is why. I mean, I'd rather have 2 points done than 1 point of 10. Because that's your sample size, is your number of points you're doing. by going to that time frame, you probably have reduced the potential of counting that same bird twice to a minimum. There's always that chance.
Yeah.
A couple of things you can watch very easily down there, and I'm not sure about up this far, turkey vultures. You can see them start to go out, I'm not going to make it, I'm going back. There's some point he knows I don't have enough height to make the next island, I'm going back.
Mm-hmm.
And I know pastrums do the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, you're sort of talking about, the islands you only need X number of point count sites. How do you determine how many you'd need for each of our 4 strata? Do they have to be done in the field?
To get to that, there's what's best way is a pilot study. Because what determines how many points you have is how much variability is there between points. And if you have nothing, you may have something on the islands 30 years ago, but that
So
part
that would be
shouldn't
the
be a problem.
first, at least one, or how many years do you have to do that before you start narrowing it? I suppose you just kind of pick at it until you get where you want it.
Yeah. There is no real, without a sample to develop your variability on, there is no real silver bullet. It's more like getting into just what some of the statisticians say. Well, if you don't have 30, if you're 30 and less than 30, you probably are going to have sample size problems.
Per X area or per X strata? I mean, like if it's one strata and it's 100 square miles, could you have the same number that you do in a strata that's 5 square miles just because it's all the same? You still need 30 in each one?
Yeah, you should.
Okay.
But
So 30 is sort of a rule of
that's
thumb.
and that's just strictly statistical
Okay.
thing. That's where
okay.
your sample T starts going haywire.
And that's why
All right,
it's so
all right.
important to know what your question is ahead of time,
Yeah.
because that helps you determine what level of power you want.
Yeah.
And
Your variability in migration, which is totally different than breeding thing.
mhm.
Your variability is going to be more from day to day
Yeah.
than from point to
So
point.
depending on conditions.
Oh, yeah.
So there, if you're able to do them every day, that variability thing now ceases to be. I mean, you don't have unknowns.
Yeah, you're erasing.
You're sampling them. The variability is still there, but it ceases to be a analysis problem because you're sampling every day. Because that's where your real variability is going to be. Now, if you've got a lot of variability between points on a given day, then you've got
Like temperature and weather.
real information on differential habitat use.
And that's how you start deciding where your points are, is the variability.
Well,
I'm not
if you feel confident that, okay, we've got these 4 strata, the islands, the peninsula, and these 2 other things, you let GIS calculate, and you could go with a percentage of habitat or whatever. Then it becomes what can you physically get done on any given day.
All right. What did you say about you better understand the habitat they're leaving to come into and come out of? Do you have to sample in the St. Croix Valley before they hit the Superior Basin, or you don't?
Well, your study area is the basin.
But you have to know.
But knowledge of prior to that basin can help you design how much you sample.
And you mean knowledge, you mean how the birds are using it, or do you mean, no, landform?
Well, is there some landform that is going to funnel birds one place or another that's outside of your study area?
Right.
Within your study area, you're going to hope hopefully your strata is getting at that.
Right.
Is there something that affects how I stratify?
So we could do that with GIS too, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then maybe.
GIS, what local birders and like that.
Yeah,
So,
okay.
you always have to be a little careful about birding information.
Yeah.
Because it's not about where birds are, it's where birders go.
Yeah.
Generally, there is a correlation
Yeah.
to it.
Okay.
That's why eBird is very dangerous
Yeah.
to use on population type stuff. It's where people go. It's not where birds are at.
Mm-hmm.
But they have used it for crowdsourcing and determining.
They use it because it's the only game in town, and they
Uh-huh.
hope the volume of information swamps out your really bad problems.
Yeah,
And
so
that
you don't
can
see
lead
any.
you down the road.
Okay. Can I just ask, because of time, because there's one more, and that is radar. Do we see any place for radar in the monitoring?
For this individual question directly, no. but radar provides a tremendous amount of potential information, anything you gather.
Those little radars.
The problem is you're only going to have
Island
one.
habitats
You're going to have one
within
radar at the very
seasonal
best.
seasons.
Where do you put it?
Uh-huh.
Is it?
You know,
What about the radio telemetry, the
Oh, yeah.
little thing they put on the back of the bird to tell us
Oh,
where they are, how long they're
nano
staying in
tags.
one area, are they feeding there, are they resting there? I mean, are those kinds of things you can then connect to habitat needs and the needs of the bird?
You could, it's going to be extremely expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Problem with the telemetry stuff is how long does that bird need to be out there before it's no longer affected by you having handled it?
Mm-hmm.
You know, when you're looking at habitat. If you're, okay, you catch it, release it in this habitat, okay, you already had it. You don't need to put it, I mean, unless the land bird assemblies would vary among habitats within a season and among season, you have some interest in stopover, how long they're staying there, then telemetry can help you. Otherwise, it's not adding to this question. There's a couple of these other questions on here, yes. But for this question, if you got the money, you get more point counts done.
Well, but I don't know about, this is just a question, but, you know, because it's that old thing, you know, where the bird's looking in and they're seeing something differently from what we're seeing. I mean, even though it would be expensive, if funding were available to put some tags on just a few birds, they might identify some areas where we didn't
Where we don't
know.
go as birders.
Yeah, or where we didn't think was important, but I mean, I found that telemetry pretty interesting, what their movements were.
Well, but that tells me then you did a bad job of setting up your sample
Oh,
stratification.
because you're supposed to.
You missed a strata of the birds. So-
Yeah, but then it's a day-to-day thing too. I
Mhm.
mean, it could be that we missed it because
On a
of the
foggy day.
Or the bird stayed on Outer Island 5 days instead of 3 days or something.
Right,
And so
but
then
they're
that
still
lends-
using that strata though.
Right, that's
Well,
not
but
really
it- but-
germane to our question.
5 days versus 1 though
Well,
is important for the
Could be land birds,
value
which
of
is
that
very-
particular habitat.
It's bird usage, yeah. But you should be picking that bird up each time you do the point count.
can I say one more thing? The strata, I mean, as far as looking at conservation of those areas and, you know, protecting what's really important, I mean, the Apostle Islands are protected, but, you know, like the clay plain, I mean, one of the problems in protecting stuff is like, you know, you say, okay, what are the important areas? And they say, okay, it's the South Shore of Lake Superior. And you're like, you know what, we got 2 staff and that does not help us.
Can change.
So, I mean, what we really are needing are to zero in on, and that, you know, limited telemetry is not going to help us, but anything that can add to the picture.
Well, if
Fine-tune it.
the part of the question of this that they have here is the land bird stands vary among habitat is conservation protection driven. You need to have some idea of what you need to be conserving, and then you make sure those get sampled very well.
So you just put the question the other way around. We know what we want to conserve. Did the birds use it? Versus the birds are using it. Let's conserve it.
Yeah, then that becomes a strata.
Yeah, so downstairs, one of the points they made is the importance of monitoring riparian corridors. Get that?
Which we talked about a little bit.
Okay.
And what monitoring riparian corridors to support that we need to conserve them, or to determine if they're of any value to birds?
We don't know how important they are.
Right.
We don't suspect they're important, but we don't know. We certainly don't have enough information up here.
So if we have other sciences that say riparian corridors are super important, but we just don't happen to know how valuable they are for birds. We're going to protect riparian corridors. It would be nice to know that birds use them too. That could bring a whole nother group of support to protecting riparian.
To me, then the riparian corridors become strata.
Yeah.
So we're going to have strata within the strata, so.
Yeah.
one
Well,
of the
no, they're
things
just
that-
kind of separate strata.
I like that.
You've got what's the clay plains,
Clay plains.
okay, which is really,
And the cacao.
there is
Those
2
are
different strata
separate
in that.
strata.
One of which also has a strata in the other section because it's another river corridor. River corridors becomes a strata, the non-river corridor
Okay.
but you
There's a lot
identify
more.
the difference between the clay plains and this eastern part.
But the clay plains are not homogeneous. I mean, there's
No.
agriculture,
Yeah.
there's woodlots, there's.
Yeah,
you know,
how
and then
those habitats are developed, land
That,
use.
but that
So
gets
that's what we
into,
need
that gets
to-
into the details of where your points end
But
up.
we can still call them the clay plains, some
Yeah,
are
it's the clay
agriculture,
plain,
some are
because
forest.
it's basically a fragmented habitat,
Right, which is
which should have
not,
different than a more continuous habitat. They
right,
take
the
it easy.
Cohogans, sloughs, and the park
So
are
in
not
that fragmented habitat,
like that.
GIS will tell you how much is
Not
woodlots, how much is of agriculture,
Yeah.
and then you sample those portions to get the overall value of the clay. Because you may find out those few woodlots are more valuable
Right.
than any point over here because it's the only game in town.
But it is a snapshot in time, just like you mentioned. We're saying that
That's why you
that
went through the
River
whole season.
Cohoggen is a big, vast wilderness, but only for today, not tomorrow. So we can't, I mean, we have to
But you
think
can't
literally.
really quantify that loss
All right. But
until tomorrow if you don't have today.
But you started with that premise on, you just said that the clay plain is fragmented,
Mhm.
but that's not
all-
necessarily true, right?
So it's